It, let's talk about the webinar today. It's pretty darn exciting to have Robin Youngson with us. Robin is a delight of a human being. He's a real mensch, as you might say in Judaism, one of the 10 people who hold up the world. He's a member of the Charter's Global Compassion Council, and he's always there to give encouragement, to help with new ideas. And that's something he's going to share with you today. You know, if I look at Robin's life and his career, one might say, gosh, Guy, you know, you've been all over the place, both in your work, starting out in the field of a career as an engineer, and then would you want that engineer to be your physician, and then your anesthetist? And so, you know, it's wonderful. It's a new way of looking at being involved in different careers. And he's coming to us from New Zealand, but he certainly has done work around the world. When I'm in Kentucky, the people in the healthcare organizations with whom the Charter is associated have nothing but great things to say about Robin. And his work now has been published in a number of different languages, including Dutch. So with that, I'm going to let Robin take over. And by the way, I really apologize. You know, the Charter is an organization that's pretty viral, and I'm coming to you from my home on Bainbridge Island in the state of Washington, in the state. And I have a dog who's slurping in the background. So I'm just going to turn it over to Robin and see how we're going to move forward. Oh, before I continue, I just want you to know that you all have an opportunity to write us a note by using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you take your cursor, go towards the end of the screen, you'll see chat. And you can send a message to Robin as in the form of a question, and we will certainly make certain that he gets that question. And also, this is being recorded, so if you wanted to go back and view it again or share it with friends, you could do that. Robin, you're up.
Thank you, Marilyn. I've never been introduced before with a loud sound of a dog lapping water in the background. So that was very fun. And so Marilyn, it's a great pleasure to have you introduce me. I'm enormously admiring of your work. I feel like a very ordinary kind of a person hidden away in this little country called New Zealand. And it's a real honor to be speaking today and to be associated with the work of the Charter of Compassion. So wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here. The sun is about to rise here. We're heading into winter. So a very warm welcome to all the participants who've chosen to give their time and to listen to this webinar and to take an interest in my book, From Hero to Healer. And I'm especially grateful to those who've been generous enough to actually choose to pay some money. It's been an interesting adventure trying to step into the gift economy and to offer something completely for free and invite people to make a donation. And because we're trying to do the work in the way that supports the values we're promoting. And
Robin, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think it is time that you put your earplugs on, only because we are getting some feedback.
Alrighty, so excuse me a moment. Right, now I have the wires hanged in. So is that better?
Yes.
Oh, right, that just about deafened me. Okay. So I'm guessing what brings all of us together to participate in this webinar is the calling of compassion. Each one of us, I think we have in common is really a concern about the state of the world seeing a lot of suffering, and really feeling compelled and motivated to try to do something about that. And that's something that's driven me for perhaps 30, 40 years. And what I want to share with you is some of our experiences from the healthcare world, and the lessons we've learned. But I think that those are really relevant, I suspect, to any other sector, whether you're working in education or government or justice or the economy or business. I think these are generic rules. So you'll know from reading my book that I'm suggesting that in our approach to social movements and trying to change the world, we should step back a bit from campaigns and battles and conflicts to a more gentler way of being. And in this webinar, I want to take it just a kind of a layer deeper to try and tease out what it is in society that's driving a lot of the suffering, a lot of the difficulties we see, whether it's social disruption or climate change. And I want to share how we came to some of these conclusions through our work in healthcare. We all know healthcare has to change. We have epidemics of obesity and chronic disease that the healthcare system is merely treating as symptoms, not addressing the underlying causes. Our healthcare system is bankrupting all of our different nations. This weekend, I'm speaking at a conference of the Royal College of Physicians of Australia in the closing session in a panel discussion. And I'm really thrilled about this topic because it's calling on physicians to step beyond just being responsible for treating disease and for addressing the social determinants of disease, things like poverty and loneliness and lifestyle factors, because we know that 80 to 90% of all chronic disease and cancer is caused by these social factors and lifestyle factors and environmental factors, and is inherently preventable. So in medicine, we need to step beyond just waiting until people are sick and then just treating that. But the question I have and the challenge I'm going to put to that conference is, well, what is the cause of the social determinants? What are the values and beliefs and assumptions in society that are the root cause of poverty, of environmental destruction, of violence, of prejudice, of all the problems that we're trying to address through compassion? In our work in healthcare, we've been campaigning now for Meredith, that's my wife, and I. We founded an organization called Hearts in Healthcare, and I've been campaigning now personally for 13 years to try to bring more compassion and humanity to healthcare. And that work has taken us to 15 countries and many different cultures, including in the Middle East. And during that time, we've been invited into many different health boards and health corporations in different countries, in New Zealand and Australia, in the USA and Canada, in Europe, in the UK, with tremendous enthusiasm from executive teams saying, yeah, this is compassion is our core business. This is what we want to do in healthcare. And running a series of presentations and workshops with staff that was, really had tremendous feedback. But I have to tell you that in all those places we've worked, we've never, ever been able to sustain a program of compassionate healthcare. Always the tyranny of the urgent, the budget cutback, the winter crisis seems to overwhelm the good intentions of the health executives to really focus on compassion and caring. And that has been really disappointing for us. And there's one place where it's been different, and that's in Louisville. And I'm going to come back to that, and maybe someone will ask me a question about that. So we've now come to the conclusion that we will no longer offer to do consulting work within healthcare organizations because we think it's futile. Because after many years of deep reflection and experiences and traveling to many countries around the world where we're seeing precisely the same issues, whether it's in a socialized healthcare system like New Zealand or the UK, or a for-profit healthcare system in the USA, or even in different cultures, such as in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, we're seeing the exact same issues. And what we've concluded is that there is a set of values underpinning healthcare, which is really completely at odds with our purpose. And the set of values that drives what happens in healthcare are these four things. The first is a materialistic science. Doctors treat patients as if they're just a machine. We don't hardly acknowledge that a patient is a conscious being. We're totally focused on identifying pathology and treating that according to evidence-based guidelines. And we're reducing medicine to imagining that disease is really a bunch of molecules dancing around and behaving badly and causing cellular disruption and then disease. And we're treating with drugs at that kind of level. So that's the first underpinning value, is a materialistic science that doesn't recognize that we're actually treating people, that we're treating conscious human beings. The second value is one of what we call industrialization, where there's so much focus put on productivity and hurrying and rushing and efficiency. And that means that healthcare has become more and more stressed, more and more hurried. There's no time for the human connection. And as we've traveled all around the world, in every country we've been, health professionals tell us we just don't have time to care anymore. So that's the second value, industrialization. The third value is a profit motive. And that might seem surprising to you when I work in New Zealand, where we have a completely socialized healthcare system. All hospital treatment in New Zealand and the public health system is completely free. Our hospitals don't even have a billing department. It doesn't exist. There's no way to create an itemized bill. And yet, the only medicines I have available to treat patients are the medicines that come from for-profit corporations, and they're all patented medicines. And there are many effective drug treatments or natural therapies which are a fraction of the cost, which are never researched and never made available to us. And there was a good example published just a few days ago. There's been a publicly funded drug trial I think in the third world, exploring the uses of a very cheap generic drug that costs $2, which assists with blood clotting. And they've shown that if a mother is hemorrhaging after a cesarean section, that the use of this drug will reduce mortality 30%. Now, we've known about this drug for about 30 or 40 years, but because it's a generic drug, because it's not protected by patent, no drug company has wanted to research, and we've not found out that we could reduce mortality by 30% in this group of patients through a drug that costs $2. So the only drugs and treatments and therapies we have, the technologies, are those created by for-profit corporations and which are patent protected. So that profit motive is very powerfully influencing the treatment I offer as a doctor, even in a socialized healthcare system like New Zealand. And the fourth value that I see within healthcare is really an aspect of the way that the medical profession behaves and the kind of culture we have. And it's very much a culture of heroism. Doctors are not really allowed to have feelings. We're battling to conquer disease in this very heroic kind of mold. And these are the four values: the materialistic science, the industrialization, the profit motive, and this heroic motive doctrine, that actually the values that determine what happens in healthcare. And there is no room for compassion and caring within this set of values. And that's the reason why our work to try to do consulting work in organizations never flourished. And the one exception is when we took that work out of the provider organizations to across a whole city in Louisville in Kentucky. And that's the one place in the world where the work has really been flourishing, because we reframed the setting of the work from not being owned by individual corporations, but being something that's across the whole community. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and just gather my thoughts and look at my notes and see where I want to take this next. So the question is, these four values in healthcare, where do they come from? We assumed for a long time that they were somehow intrinsic to the culture of healthcare. But the conclusion we've come to now is that actually know that these are societal values. And the same kind of drivers are probably present in education, in justice, in social services, in the economic system. And I think these fundamental values are really causing a lot of the problems in society that we're trying to address. So the writer who has helped us most and really understand where these values come from is Charles Eisenstein, and his astonishing book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And Charles talks about a societal myth, a set of stories of assumptions and beliefs that really describes the world to us. And much of this is quite unconscious. And he talks about the old story that we're stuck in and the possibility of a new story, a story of interbeing that we might aspire to. So where does this old story come from? Well, it traces its roots right back, certainly to the age of the Enlightenment, and a belief that rationality is going to win the day, that rational thought and science and technology are going to solve all of societal problems. This is the age of Newton and Descartes. It's beginning to uncover laws of physics of the universe, discovering there's a kind of clockwork universe. And that put in place a set of beliefs that all of society could be described in that kind of way, in a machine kind of metaphor. And it very profoundly influenced economic thinking, because Adam Smith wrote laws of economics as if it was physics. And his assumption was that every individual is competing to maximize their own personal economic advantage. And that's the fundamental basis of the economic system we still have today. And that has some pretty profound consequences. Now, this is a world, the old story is a world of separation, where each man and woman is separate from each other. We're just like atomic particles subject to the laws of physics. And we are separate from nature. And deeply embedded within this old story and this story of separation is the concept of ownership. And the concept of ownership is so pervasive in our Western society that we don't even notice it anymore, but it has some really particularly serious consequences. One of which is that in this idea about ownership and the pursuit of endless economic growth, what that means is that we must take every human gift and gift of nature and turn it into a commodity. So a rainforest is not a wonderful ecological system that we depend upon for our survival. It's a set of trees that can be cut down and logged and turned into a profit. That every human story and idea and song has to be copyrighted and controlled and sold for a profit. That all the things that we used to provide in society, like care of the elderly and childcare and education, now become economic commodities that have to be controlled and bought and sold. And even the air we breathe and the water is now being controlled and sold. And this has led to an extractive economy where the role of man is to dominate nature and to just extract resources endlessly in support of economic growth. And this is causing complete craziness. And here in New Zealand, the government has decided it would be a good idea to create an open cast coal mine on the west coast of the South Arm, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty. And in fact, the land they're proposing to this is already a nature reserve, conservation land. And they think this is a good idea to create employment and increase GDP, regardless of the consequences of the climate when we're about to destroy the earth. In this world of ownership, of individuality, it's a world of competition, which is not competition which is good, which is striving for excellence, but it's competition for each of us to get more and more stuff. And in that world, it means that more for you means less for me. And therefore, we spend all of our lives trying to accumulate more and more money and possessions in a materialistic and consumer way. And it doesn't have to be like that, because our experience of stepping into the gift economy says that, you know, more for you actually means more for me as well. Our entire economic system is based on scarcity because the only way that anything can have a price is by becoming scarce, because if something is completely freely available, it has no price at all. So in the economic system, it has no value. So we actually have created a myth of the world which itself produces scarcity, that set of ideas and that those ideas about ownership are actually the drivers of poverty. And we have a particularly nasty form of that in the last several decades of neoliberal economics, which is concentrating wealth in a smaller and smaller and smaller proportion of the world, while 90% of us get poorer. So this is the set of values and ideas and assumptions and beliefs around the world, which Charles Eisenstein calls the old story, which are very prevalent in society. And those are the things that drove those 4 values in healthcare I talked about. Now, the role of social movements is to address the societal and environmental issues that really governments and corporations are not addressing. So we're seeing many tens of millions of people around the world mobilizing quite powerfully to try to address these issues. But in my book, I really raise a question about, you know, are social movements actually being successful? Are we making progress, or are we going backwards? And I think in many regards, we are actually going backwards. Certainly in New Zealand, we're seeing more and more poverty, more and more disadvantage. Our rates of childhood poverty are appalling, more and more domestic violence. The demand for mental health services and addiction services in New Zealand has almost doubled in the last decade. So this is a set of societal beliefs and values that is driving us backwards. Our environmental standards are slipping. Now in New Zealand, of all the rivers that are monitored, more than half of them are not safe to swim in anymore. There's so much pollution from industrialized farming that we can't even swim in the rivers anymore. So why are social movements not making more progress? And I think the reason is because we're so deeply immersed in this old story that the social movements are too. And that our social movements are really based on a rhetoric of campaigns and battling and demonizing the opposition, whether it's the government or the politician or the corporation. And this, again, is the story of separation. That is falling back into all of our assumptions and beliefs from the old story. And so in our very act of being part of a social movement and with these kind of strategies, we're actually reinforcing the underlying assumptions and beliefs and values that I believe are the cause of the problems we're trying to address. And I don't believe anymore that social movements and the way that we've constructed them are capable of addressing the problems that all of us are so concerned about. And so in our work in Hearts and Healthcare, we are no longer going to campaign at all. We're not even going to promote an agenda. We want to try to construct a social movement in a very different framework, which is in what Charles Eisenstein calls the news story. So what of the news story? What does that look like? The news story he talks about is a world of interbeing. It assumes that that consciousness and material matter, which in the old story are completely separate domains. So spirituality is something that's kind of put out there in a separate domain. It's nothing to do with the real world at all, the material world, the real world. But in the new story, all matter has consciousness and everything is profoundly connected. And that's actually much more aligned with reality. And quantum physics is telling us that even atomic particles on other sides of the universe are profoundly entangled and connected together. And it means that every human being is profoundly connected to every other human being on the world and to the natural world and to the natural environment. And it means that if we do things to damage Mother Earth, then that has terrible consequences for us at all. In the world of interbeing, we could imagine that the smallest act of compassion could be as powerful to change the whole world as the biggest, social movement, because we're profoundly connected. So these ideas seem quite counterintuitive in the way that we've lived our lives, this idea of consciousness and connection. So I want to share with you some personal examples of how I've begun to see the world in a different way, and how I've begun to understand the incredible power of consciousness to change the world, rather than campaigning and fighting. So I want to tell some stories about that. Now, I'm an anesthesiologist, and a number of years ago, I was on duty for a maternity unit. Each week on a Tuesday for 24 hours, I was the anesthesiologist on call to do epidural injections for pain relief, to attend to mothers who needed an emergency cesarean section, to do consultations, procedures, and so on. And on this day, I'd had a particularly busy day. I started work at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd worked pretty much flat out for 15 hours. It was quite a stressful day. And I got back to bed at about 11 o'clock at night. And my wife, Meredith, had cooked me a beautiful dinner. It was still in the oven, a bit dried out, but I was still grateful for that. And I got back to bed at midnight, really completely exhausted. At 1 a.m., my phone rang, and it was the midwife asking me to come to the hospital and do an epidural for pain relief in labor. So I drove to the hospital, did the procedure, made sure everything was working well, was safe, came back home again, got back to bed at 2 a.m. At 2:30, my phone rang again. There was a baby in trouble, fetal distress. The mother needed a very urgent cesarean section, and I rushed to the hospital, took care of the mother and the baby. They were all fine. That took 2 hours, so I got back to bed at 4:30, having had very little sleep and feeling extremely exhausted and tired. I fell asleep, and 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. Now, I was in that confusional state where you're sleep deprived and you've only been asleep a few minutes, and I was beating the life out of the alarm clock, trying to stop it ringing. And Meredith was saying, "Robin, for God's sake, just answer the phone," because I couldn't figure out that it was my phone ringing. I thought it was the alarm clock. So I answered the phone, and it was the midwife saying, "Please come back to the hospital and do another epidural." And I was really, really angry about that, because I'd just been in bed for 10 minutes, and why couldn't they call me when I was already in the hospital? So I drove the 10 minutes to the hospital, really, really feeling angry and frustrated and really ropeable, and feeling very sorry for myself. And the relationship between doctors and midwives is not always the easiest. We have very different philosophies and very different worldviews. And sometimes when I'm called into our labor room to attend to mother and do an epidural, it's not a very good reception I get, because the mother had an 8-page birth plan, which is all about natural things, and it was not going to have any doctors or any technology. And now the mother has let the side down, and the midwife is annoyed. And because she's asked for an epidural, and now we have a medical intervention, which is the slippery slope towards a C-section as opposed to a natural birth. So sometimes the reception I would get when called into a labor room would not be positive at all. I'd feel like the devil coming into the room. So I was having all these angry, ropeable, irritable thoughts driving into the hospital. I was really in quite a state. And halfway there, I suddenly felt ashamed. I really felt ashamed. It just flooded over me. Because in that moment, I remembered why I am a physician. I remembered why I became a doctor. That's because I wanted to respond to suffering. And I began to reflect on the extraordinary privilege of this invitation to attend to a mother in childbirth, one of the most intimate events in life, to see someone very vulnerable and afraid and in pain, and to know that my technical skills, my compassion and caring could make an extraordinary difference to that patient's experience. And at that moment, as I reflect on that, I couldn't think of a more privileged thing to do in the whole world. So at that moment, I decided to do a thought experiment. And that is that anytime I noticed that the thoughts in my head were getting kind of angry or irritable, I would try and recognize that, and I would replace them with thoughts of the extraordinary privilege of the work we're called to do. So I tried this for 3 months as a kind of thought experiment. So what happened? Well, it was really extraordinary, because in that 3 months, all of the difficult midwives had a personality transplant. And now when I'm invited into the room, I'm welcomed like a hero, and I'm introduced to everyone. And the equipment and the trolley, everything I need is already in the room, and the mother's already on the bed in the position to have the injection done. I get it done in 5 minutes. The pain relief worked better. There were fewer complications, fewer cesarean sections. I thought, wow, that's amazing. The only person who changed in the whole world was me, and yet the whole world changed around me. And that was the first inkling I had of the incredible power of consciousness, that when we change ourselves, we change the whole world. Now, the midwives probably thought that I'd had a personality transplant as well. So that's the first example, the first inkling I had that we are profoundly connected, and that choosing an attitude, being conscious, could really be powerful. The next example is, again, paradoxical. It's the paradox of time, because as we travel around the world, everyone tells us we just don't have time to care anymore. Healthcare has become so busy, so many procedures to do, so many patients to see. So all of us are feeling very, very intense time pressure in our work. So I want you to imagine me in the operating room doing a list of patients. These are day case patients. I'm going to anesthetize 8 human beings that day. I've never met any of those people before. And yet they're trusting their lives to me. And because we don't want to keep patients waiting the whole day in the hospital, we don't bring them all in before the list. So I don't have any opportunity to meet them before we start. But I have to interrupt the list in between every case while the surgeon is waiting impatiently in the operating room to do the next case. I have to go to the preoperative area and find the patient on the notes and sit down and try and make a human connection and complete my anesthetic and medical assessment and do informed consent and have the patient prepared to come into the operating room. And it feels like that would take an awfully long time. And I have just a few minutes to spend to do that, and the surgeon's waiting impatiently. So what I discovered is the paradox, which is that if you don't have enough time, you should slow down. And what I do in my practice these days is, with every single patient, to take a great deal of care with the introductions, to make sure I'm on a level with the patient sitting on the bed or a chair, that we really have made an introduction, a connection. I explain my name and what my role is, because I'm the 7th person in blue scrubs appearing before the patient. And the patient doesn't know if I'm a nurse or a technician or a surgeon or an anesthesiologist, whatever. It's very confusing. So I take a lot of trouble with introductions and making sure they know exactly who I am and what my role is. And then I make myself very still and very attentive. And I ask, how are you? And I really pay attention, looking for signs of anxiety and tension, and I explore those and spend some time really finding out what's most important for the patient, and putting their minds at ease and forming that bond of human connection and trust. Now, it sounds like that would take an awful long time, and I have to do that 8 times every day. And this is just in the few minutes in between the cases. But what I found is that when you slow down and make that investment of time and human connection, that the day goes so much better. All the surgeries flow well. The patient's condition and recovery in the post-operative recovery room is much better. They have much less pain, much less nausea, fewer side effects. I'm not getting called back all the time to the post-op room to sort out problems. By the end of the day, the surgeon is somehow in a better humor, and we finish the list on time. And this is the paradox of time, that if you're busy, you should slow down, should make the human connection. And it's deeply counterintuitive, but it always works. And every time you have the presence, the consciousness to slow down, the day will go much better and you'll get things done more quickly. The third example I want to give you of the power of consciousness is all of the research evidence we found about how incredibly powerfully compassionate caring influences hard clinical outcomes. So there are 2 randomized controlled trials in my area of work, very well conducted scientific trials. The first one at Harvard, a Harvard hospital, which asked anesthesiologists to do their pre-op consultation in one of two different ways. And one was the way that I would have done for most of my career, which is to be pretty clinically detached and focus on a series of technical questions and informed consent and explanation, and doing that in a very expert way, but kind of detached. And the other way is to be more empathetic and warm and supportive, and to really make that connection with the patient. And that takes an equal amount of time. And this was a randomized controlled trial where anesthesiologists randomly were assigned to use one script or the other. And that the second method would have been quite difficult for a lot of anesthesiologists because we're in a very technical specialty. We chose a career where we didn't much have to talk to patients. And what the trial showed is that when the anesthesiologists adopted this more positive, caring, empathetic pre-op consultation, it halved the dose of morphine required after major surgery. And it very substantially reduced the length of stay, the number of days the patient spent in hospital. And a very similar trial has been reported just in the last year or two. And they showed that when there was an empathetic, supportive, compassionate pre-op consultation, that surgical wound healing was actually better, that surgical outcomes were better, again, that length of stay. So this capacity to make the human connection with patients is actually changing the patient's biology, is changing cellular function, is changing gene expression, is changing the immune system, is changing wound healing. And when we look at the evidence from right across the world, we come to the conclusion that the effect size of compassionate caring is about on patient outcomes is about equal to the effect size of most of the drugs we use. And yet it is completely neglected in medicine because we have a materialistic science that doesn't recognize we have a human being in front of us. We just have a series of pathologies that we need to treat with technologies and surgeries and drug. So, you know, we've had a lot of work to do around the world to try and let people know how powerful this effect is. There's a group in Harvard that have done what we call a meta-analysis, where you look at all the published papers, looking at the best designed randomized controlled trials, and you put and synthesize all the information together to look at the true effect size and the best evidence, scientific evidence we have. And they concluded that for a male patient, that having a doctor who cared for you would reduce your 5-year mortality more than smoking cessation. And that's an extraordinary finding. So that's another example of how human connection and consciousness powerfully changes the world in a material way. The fourth example I want to give is a series of stories that we've heard from around the world. We've done very intimate workshops with thousands of health professionals and students in many different countries. And we've asked health professionals to tell us stories of one day they had an extraordinary healing connection with a patient. And there's an archetypal story that we're hearing again and again and again of patients in deep life crisis, either with profoundly suicidal illness or a terminal diagnosis, or when in really profound life crisis and where the doctor has no medicines to offer. And it's a situation in which doctors, and as I did for most of my career, feel completely incompetent, helpless. You just have nothing to, you know, the worst thing a physician can say to a patient is, I'm so sorry, there's nothing I can do. In the world of materialistic science, that is literally true. In the science of consciousness and compassion and caring, that's completely untrue, because what we've learned from these stories, from my own experience, is that if a patient is in life crisis, if you can have the courage as a doctor or a nurse to sit with the patient in their darkest place, do not shy away, to bring that compassionate presence, not even to say anything, just to be there, to witness the suffering, that something really magical happens. And time again, we've heard the stories of how patients have been transformed by this capacity of a health professional just to be still, to be present, to be compassionate, to listen. And the patient who was deeply suicidal somehow turned their life around and start a new life. They find hope the willingness of another human being to witness them in their darkest place, gives them a feeling of being acknowledged, of being valued, of human connection that somehow changes their life around. Patients with a serious terminal illness sometimes surviving for a decade when the doctor said you're only going to survive 3 years, because they find hope and connection again. So that's the fourth example of the incredible power of consciousness to change the world. And the fifth example is what I mentioned briefly in the beginning, is our experiment, our adventure in stepping into the gift economy, because as we've done our work, Meredith, my wife, has particularly been helpful in calling me up on this. She says, you know, Robin, you really have to be the change you want to see. We have to make sure that the way in which we do our work really supports the values we're trying to promote. And we became very uncomfortable with the transactional nature of some of the work we do. Negotiating a speaking fee or deciding what price to sell a book for, that felt really uncomfortable, because that was really stepping back into the old story of separation and ownership. So now, as a speaker, I don't quote a fee at all. If I agree to go and speak at an event or support an organization, I say, I will come and I will serve your organization, your event, to the very best I can. And we won't just fly in and speak and disappear again, but we'll come for the whole event and immerse ourselves in the culture of your meeting, of your profession, of your nation, and try and understand where you're at and how we can best contribute to that. And if you would like, you can make a donation to support our work. And my new book, From Hero to Healer, I'm giving that away as a gift with no expectation of payment. What we've actually found is, stepping into that world of trying to be generous, is that we're actually earning more money now without a price than we were at the time we were charging a fee. The generosity of the world is just extraordinary. It enables us to do a great deal of work for free, especially for small community groups and organizations that don't have the funding. Because some of the bigger organizations that have the capacity to be generous, you know, we're just completely humbled by the generosity. And someone paid $100 for my book. It's available completely for free. You know, why would they do that? That makes no sense at all. In the old story, in the new story, it makes complete sense. Because in the new story, it says more for you means more for me. So there's 5 examples from my world of how profoundly consciousness and connection have a very vivid reality within my world. And that's kind of the new story of interconnection, of interbeing. So my final question is, if we were to reimagine social movements, what would they look like in the new story? And I've been reflecting very deeply on this question, because it's hard to imagine, because we're so deeply immersed in the assumptions or beliefs of the old story. But I've come to a rather surprising conclusion, and that is that if we're going to have a social movement that sits in the new story, a story of interbeing, of generosity, of profound connection, that we can no longer battle or advocate or persuade, that actually what we need is a movement with no agenda at all, a movement with no cause. Doesn't that sound kind of crazy? What it means is that instead of arguing for a cause or agenda, we should be living our lives, each of us individually, as if we profoundly believed that we're connected, as if we profoundly believe that we're interdependent, as if we profoundly believe that the more generous we are, the more generous the world would be, that more for you means more for me. And that, I think, is the kind of movement that we need in the world, to commit ourselves to a way of living where our way of being in lives is the path of leadership itself. It's a movement with no cause and no agenda, simply a consciousness. And that if more and more of us could live our lives in that manner, then we would begin to address the myth of our society, the assumptions and beliefs, that we begin to tackle the problems of unemployment and poverty and environmental degradation and violence and all the things in the world that we're profoundly concerned about. And we make a profound commitment to try to live our lives in that way, and to bring our consciousness and presence, believing that that is the most powerful way to change the world for the better. So that's the set of ideas I wanted to share with you today. The kind of questions I really love the most are the yes, but questions. Yeah, Robin, but, you know, get real. Don't you realize in our world we have to do this? And I love those questions because it gives us an opportunity to reframe those ideas within a different perspective. So thank you so much all for listening. It's a great honor and privilege to be working with the Child of Compassion and share my ideas with you. I'm hoping we have some questions. I'm not sure how this is going to work. Mimi, I think it's going to help.
We have questions and comments, but I think that you just introduced a whole new series of questions. At least I think you did, and I hope people would add some additional questions in the chat box, and then I'll share those with you. But I just wanted to say, you know, thank you so much for everything that you've just said. And Robin and I, and one of the people from who's leading our Charter for Compassion Education Institute, have been talking about the gift economy. And so I had an invitation a few months ago to go to Jordan. And so I thought I would do exactly what Robin said. And, you know, they asked how much money would I need to come to Jordan. And I said, well, it would be helpful if I had a plane ticket. And they said, oh no, that's in our budget, but what will you be charging? And I said, well, you let me know after my involvement of the 3.5 days. It has been so interesting because I was working with 11 schools, and I think that we've received now 3 checks to the charter. I worked hard, like you said. I mean, I just put my all into it, got so excited, so immersed, and I'm sure that the charter made more money than if I would have said, you know, here's a set fee. So that was really quite exciting. And we do the same thing with these webinars. You know, they're free, and if people like what they hear, or they think that we should keep forward in doing this, then, you know, there's an opportunity for them to help us pay for this platform so we can do that. But I'm looking for questions, and, you know, I just wanted to say, Robin, that there's a great mentor, another one to the charter, David Corton, and I don't know if you've read his book. Yeah. And, you know, David's whole thing is change the story and you change the future. So, you know, I want to change the story, and, you know, not necessarily to have, you know, Occupy Wall Street, or a need for Black voices to be heard, or, you know, if we go around the world. But how do we get the message out there? Do we have a silent movement of people being nice? Or, you know, we're so ingrained in movements and campaigns. How do you go about this?
Yeah, I think the most powerful way we change the world is actually by a personal example. And I think, you know, and sharing our stories and being vulnerable. What I found is that, you know, becoming an evangelist just really defeats your cause. And I found that the greatest power I had as a leader to influence people was to be profoundly vulnerable, to share my own mistakes and my vulnerabilities, to show emotions in front of people, to kind of break the rules of how we're supposed to behave as a doctor or a corporate leader. And that allows people to kind of open up and begin to share their own stories. So the most profound thing we can do is share stories. And I think it's really important to write. And when I think about the enormous influence of Charles Eisenstein, he's just one person, but his book has influenced, his books have influenced so many people around the world and really helped shift our understanding of what's going on. So I think it's our personal example. It's, you know, the question itself is starting to fall back into the old story again, because we're kind of, it's assuming that we're not connected, that somehow we have to organize and mobilize lots of followers to make a difference in the world. In the new story, we just profoundly know that one small act of compassion could change the whole world without having to have followers. And recently you asked me what I've been reading. I've been reading The Tao of Leadership, as translated by John Hyder. It's a translation of the Tao Te Ching. It's very ancient Chinese knowledge about how to be a wise leader. And he really says that the leader should be prepared to be childlike and appear foolish and to have few followers and to be mysterious, because no one can understand what the leader is talking about, because it's a style of leadership that pays exquisite attention to all behaviors without making a judgment whether they're good or bad. And it just allows people to kind of grow within themselves. But it's, a lot of these ideas are really quite counterintuitive. We have to keep reminding ourselves about a different set of assumptions. You know, we have to stop counting how many followers we have on Facebook. It really is the way that we lead our lives daily. Choosing to ride an electric bicycle to work instead of the car, choosing to eat less meat, getting rid of possessions, being more generous, stepping away from transactional relationships. These things resonate very powerfully across the world, far more powerfully than any number of, you know, campaigns or signing petitions. So you really kind of have to experience it to begin to believe it, because it's quite counterintuitive.
I know that when I was involved in teacher training, I used the works of Rudolf Dreikurs quite a bit. And one of the principles that he shared in his writings was that you need to have the courage to be imperfect. Yeah. And I mean, I think that, you know, that was, if there was one lesson that I tried to always work with future teachers, was that, you know, you have to take a chance, and you have to engage and take that risk.
And that's the lesson of being vulnerable as a leader, because if we want people to learn to really change their view of the world, we have to create a circumstance, a situation where it is safe to be wrong, where it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to admit your mistakes. It's okay to say, well, for most of my career, I did something that harmed patients. And the most powerful way we can do that is to be vulnerable. But I want to touch on kind of politics a little bit, because, you know, I don't really want to comment on Trump, because I don't live in the USA, and our own leaders in New Zealand are doing lots of equally idiotic things, like deciding to create an open cast coal mine in conservation land, which is in the news this week. The question is, you know, we kind of think that the policies that Trump is promoting are going to cause a lot of suffering. But I wonder if we can kind of turn that around, and not say so much that leaders like Trump are the cause of suffering, but that they are the symptom of suffering. And we are all deeply implicated in the way we have led our lives, and the values and assumption beliefs, that the old story, the myth that we've led our lives, have really created the conditions in which leaders like Trump or greedy corporate leaders could naturally arise. So I see leaders like Trump as really being a symptom of suffering, not a cause of suffering. And each of us is deeply implicated. And every single time that we go into transactional relationships, every single time we try and own more stuff, every single time we drive a car and pollute the world, every single time that every single time that we eat meat we damage the climate of the world. So each of us in our small daily actions are profoundly implicated in creating the conditions in which we get the leaders that we get the leaders that we deserve. And from a compassionate point of view, we want to stand back into less judgment, and to understand that a lot of those leaders are suffering greatly. And we've discovered that in our work in healthcare. We've done work in Louisville with very senior health executives. And it's very easy to get very angry about the actions of some of those people because they're promoting a set of values which is fundamentally at odds with our purpose of healing and compassion and caring. And what we discovered through an anonymous process is that those health executives are profoundly suffering. They're incredibly stressed. Of the executives we met, having uncovered the levels of stress and suffering they have, as a doctor, I would have recommended that about a third of them should immediately go on stress relief and are not in a fit state to be working. So a lot of the people that we want to be angry about and blaming themselves are kind of victims of society and are suffering a great deal. And if we can see that suffering and step back and be less judgment and see that their actions as symptoms of the worldview that we have all individually created and all individually sustained, and that we're all culpable in that, then that allows us to see that we each one have tremendous power to change the world, because we can make different assumptions, different beliefs, different assumptions. We can live our life in a way that supports the new story and doesn't fall back into the old story.
There's a message here for you, and it says, please consider yourself to be hugged. But there's another question here. I love abundance accounting, but it is quite a privilege. How do we translate between the material and spiritual practicality when so many don't feel this freedom?
We just have to live it in our everyday lives. We just have to become more mindful. We have to think about, how we bring up our children, that every time we achieve, praise our child for doing well in a maths test, we're part of the old story, that if we were to praise them for empathy and compassion and caring, we might help create a better world. And I think it comes down to that. It comes down to our individual choices in every moment of the day, the choosing the attitude, the choosing not to be the angry doctor, but to remember my purpose deeply, and to bring a sense of gratitude and privilege to the work that we're able to do in any community. I think it really comes down to that. And it's...
I think you bring up a point that we try and pay some attention to, but probably not enough in the charter, and that is that there are so many silos of people, and we choose for comfort to talk to the people in our own silo, but that because of social media and all those clicks that we're trying to achieve, we don't have that cross-pollination of community, of dialogue. And so, the hope that I have is that I experienced that kind of life, I think, that you were talking about, being part of growing up in Steel Town in Pennsylvania, where people knew one another, and experienced and fought with one another, but really shared with one another. And I just remember, gardens in a city where people were sharing, and we just I don't think do that, and we have to find new avenues for doing that. We are a few minutes after the call already. This has been incredible. It's a foundation, and I should say that we are talking with Robin about the possibility of him offering a course through the Charter Education Institute. And as always, the main source of us getting the word out is through our newsletters. So please stay tuned, listen to, not listen to, but read the newsletters. And I don't know, you know, Robin, you've, at least for me and that person who said, consider yourself to be hugged, you know, this has been truly wonderful. And I think that it's given us so much to think about. And so thank you from over here on the Northwest Coast, all the way to New Zealand, and grateful for all the people who could make the call today. And we'll be posting this, sending it to you so that you can share it with friends, and it'll also eventually be on YouTube. Bye, Robin. Thanks so much. Bye.
Blessings to you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.